In the early 2000s, a man in his late 30s was sitting in a small studio in Tokyo reading a book. The book was Watchmaking by George Daniels, the English watchmaker, and the same George Daniels we will be talking about extensively next week. See how I did that? I teased it a little bit. I'm getting better at this. Now, the man reading the book was not a watchmaker. He had no formal training in watchmaking, he had no apprenticeship, he had no master. He was a product designer with a degree from the Tokyo University of the Arts. And this person had run a design consultancy for like the previous 10 years, working on industrial design projects. He was reading the Daniels book because it had become interesting, and he was interested in watches as an object, and he wanted to understand how they were made. He wanted to know specifically whether he could make one. So he bought lathes on eBay, he watched YouTube tutorials, he set up a workshop, he started cutting metal. 4 years later, he produced Japan's first in house tourbillon wristwatch. Let that sink in for a second. 6 years later, he was admitted to the Academy Horology Creature Independence, which is basically like the Independent Watchmakers Horological Society, right? And it's the most exclusive independent watchmakers association in the world, of which George Daniels himself had been a member until his death in 2011. And the man's name, Hajime Asaoka. And he is, by serious consensus, I think the most influential living independent watchmaker in Japan. And so today is part two of our Japan series. But I'm getting into now the watchmakers working outside the institutional systems, alone, in homes and in small workshops, often single individuals producing some of what I would say are the most extraordinary watches in the modern world. Again, almost nobody in the Western press is going to talk about these guys, so I'm going to spend an episode talking about them. And by the end of this hour or so, I hope that you at least know their names. Maybe you get excited to be able to go Google them and check them out, or get on Chrono 24 and see if anything's available. You never know.
In a small room in Kyoto, a lens of morning on your hands. You turn the wheels.
Welcome back to What's on Your Riste. I'm Watchovski. Last week we got into Japan Part 1, and I called that the heavy hitters, right? Seiko, Grand Seiko, Crador, Citizen, Casio. And I call them kind of the institutions, the industrial scale precision that made the engineering case for Japanese watchmaking at the very top tier. And now Part 2, kind of the opposite end. I'm going to call these the independents, the individual watchmakers who, like Philippe Dufour or Recep Recepi, they're working on one at a time in tiny quantities to a standard that match the apex of Swiss hot horology. And these are the names that in 5 years, I think every serious collector is going to get to know. And today is a chance to kind of get to know them first. So settle in. We're going to meet a couple of watchmakers from, from a place that you know but you don't know, and maybe one young brand. So let's get into our first example here. We're going to get into Hajime Asaoka, and he's the designer who taught himself. So let me tell you a little bit about Asaoka's story, because I think it's one of the more remarkable origin stories in modern watchmaking. And for me, honestly, I feel like the story needs to be told, especially in a platform where these podcasts can kind of live on well beyond me. And my hope is that by shining light on this, maybe one or two watchmakers, maybe future watchmakers get inspired, right? Maybe you're someone who listens to podcasts and has never thought about watchmaking. Maybe that inspires you to do something, right? I know this podcast was inspired by other folks that were kind of going out on a limb and just doing something they were passionate about. And for me, discussing and telling these stories is a passion of mine, and that's why I want to share it with you. So, Hajime was born in 1965, Kanajiwa Prefecture in Japan, and he graduated from the Tokyo University of Arts in 1990. He got a degree in design, again, not watchmaking, like industrial design. And he spent his 20s and early 30s as a product designer. So in 1992, he's about 27 years old. He established his own design consultancy in Tokyo. And he spent like the next decade or so designing consumer products and like industrial objects. But somewhere along the way, and exactly when is not entirely clear from all the public record, he became fascinated with watches. Now, not as a collector, as kind of an engineer's curiosity. and he wanted to understand how mechanical watches were built, how the gear trains worked, how the escapement actually regulated time. And specifically, he was fascinated by how a tourbillon cage was actually rotating. And so the standard path for someone in his position would be to collect. That's most of us, right? Buy interesting watches, read the books, listen to a podcast, maybe take a basic course, grab a simple Seiko movement and disassemble and see if we can reassemble it, but never to actually attempt to make one. And Asaoka didn't take the path that regular folks like you or I might be taking. So in 2005, at age 40, he decided to teach himself watchmaking. And the textbook that he chose was Watchmaking by George Daniels. Now, again, that's a banger of a book to go and say like, "Oh, I'm gonna read my first book," right? And then you go and pick up like the some of the greatest literature of all time, right? And so the same book that again Roger W. Smith used to teach himself in his parents' garage in Bolton, England, and that was 15 years earlier. And so the same book has more than any other single object, I think, been responsible for the modern revival of complete hand fabricated watchmaking. And so I think that all will go circle back to George Daniels. Now, Asaoka, he bought lathes on eBay. He watched these YouTube tutorials and he set up this small workshop in his Tokyo studio and he began to cut metal. And he had, by his own admission, no fear of failure. He had no formal training to protect. He had no master to disappoint. He was approaching this craft as an engineer would approach a problem. Can this be done? And if so, how? Right? The questions that he asks were completely different, and I love the questions that he was asking. But what happened next, by the standards of conventional watchmaking pedagogy, is it's impossible. Okay. In 2009, just 4 years after this guy started, he completed Japan's first in house tourbillon wristwatch prototype. He called it the Tourbillon 1, and he had taught himself alone to produce one of the most complex mechanisms in horology. Now, in 2011, now he's 46 years old, he formally launched the brand Hajime Asaoka, Tokyo, Japan, and began selling watches under his own name. And we know that from Recep's example and story as well, branding under your own name, you know exactly who the watchmaker is that's on the dial of your watch. The Tourbillon 1 led to his admission into the academy, the AHCI, which is again the Swiss-based Association of Independent Watchmakers, again founded in 1985 by, I believe it was Vincent and Sven Calabrese and Anderson. I could be mistaken, by the way. Those names are not correct, but I should have had that in my notes. I think it was Vincent and Sven, but if I'm wrong, correct me. And so membership in this group is actually by invitation only. And so the AHCI currently has about 30 active members worldwide. And so Asaoka was admitted or brought into the team in 2015. And he's only the second Japanese member in the organization's history. And his current collection consists basically of 4 models. He has the Tsunami. It's a 37 millimeter hand. It's a 3-hand time only watch. It has a very distinctive plate movement architecture and this oversized free sprung balance. And the wheel is mounted kind of prominently on the dial side, which is always unique. So on the side that's actually you're looking at, you can actually see this oversized free sprung balance. Very, very pretty. Now, the Tsunami is the watch that most people know when they associate to his work. It's a piece that announces, I think, immediately that the watchmaker is doing something different than what everybody else is doing. Tsunami, at the time of this recording, is priced around 25 grand. Okay. Then he has the Project T as in the tourbillon. It's a watch that he produced in collaboration with 2 Japanese precision manufacturers, OSG, which is a kind of a major tool maker, and then Yuki Precision, it's YUKI, an aerospace grade precision component maker. Well, what a smart idea to go into aerospace and make a connection there because of the precision required for some of those tools and parts, right? So the Project T uses these ball bearings instead of traditional ruby jewels in very critical positions in the watch. And it's this radical departure from what a horological convention might stay is the standard. Because it's inspired by aerospace engineering rather than watchmaking tradition, it's a total different take on the way that a tourbillon is going to be built, and specifically how a watch is going to be built. Those start Again, at the time of this recording, around $80,000. There's a chronograph, and it's his interpretation of what a columnar chronograph would look like. And it's based on the tsunami movement architecture and then built up a bit. And that one is around 120,000. And he, to my understanding, at the time of this recording, there's only like been 3 that he's ever produced. And so you have also the tourbillon, and I believe it's the Purat. It's Purat, but I think the T is silent, so Purat. And then the tourbillon noir. And those are his most recent tourbillon variants, and production it's extreme. He produces fewer than like 5 watches per year, like total across the entire collection. So like by 2018, after 7 years of producing watches commercially, he completed 19 pieces. Each watch represents hundreds of hours of individual handwork. And there is one detail about his watches that I want to highlight because I think it tells you something about him as a man. He does not source all of his components from new manufacturers. He sources difficult components from these historic unitas movements. Again, pocket watch movements from earlier in the 20th century. He uses cases that were produced by automotive suppliers when conventional case manufacturers couldn't produce what he needed. And over the years, he's developed working relationships and this wonderful connection with the Swiss, including contacts like Philippe Dufour or Antoine Prezioso. And these two both share amazing knowledge and components and then guidance with him. And that is the network of modern hot horology. People like Philippe Dufour, again, helped this self-taught Japanese product designer source components for watches that the Japanese watchmaker needed to make things by hand in Tokyo. And Asaoka said in interviews that his goal is to surprise his fellow watchmakers in Switzerland. That's the bar he sets for his work. Not commercial success, not like marketing position. It's to surprise the Swiss. What a beautiful way to deliver a product. My goal here isn't to make a ton of money. My goal here isn't to have a massive spread on a magazine or be acknowledged by anyone. My goal here is to surprise an entire industry. And by any reasonable measure, I would say that he has successfully completed that goal, but I think his goal is to continue to surprise. Now, there's also one thing that he has done that is worth knowing because it changes the accessibility and the aesthetics significantly. In 2018, he co-founded a more accessible sub-brand called Kurono Tokyo. It's Kurono Tokyo. And we're going to get into Kurono in its own segment kind of later in the episode, but the relationship matters. It matters specifically to him because this ACCI master watchmaker who's making, like 5 watches a year at $25,000 to like $150,000 per year. He's also the designing force of a brand that sells watches in like the sub $3,000 range. And it's the same eye, it's the same Japanese sensibility, but it's this different price tier that's much more accessible. Okay. Now, segment 2, we're going to get into our insider who waited 29 years. I believe this watchmaker is Naoya Hida. Naoya Hida. And he's our second watchmaker. And so Hida's path is almost the opposite of Asaoka's. Asaoka was self-taught outsider. Hida is the consummate industry. I don't want to say insider because that's the wrong word, but he was in the industry. He spent 29 years working inside global luxury brands before he launched his own brand. He began with his career at Desco von Schultes. And this is the major watch importer and distributor. You don't know who they are. From there, he moved into senior distribution and the brand management roles for Japanese markets. And this is going to be big because you're going to know these brands. He started to work with the management roles for Swiss watchmakers like Breguet, Vacheron Constantin, Jaeger-LeCoultre, AP, Daniel Roth. And you're going to see his Roth. It's R-O-T-H, but I believe it's pronounced Roth. And then obviously FP Journe. And Hida is credited with launching FP Journe in Japan in 2004. And he was the man who, more than any other single figure, he established Journe's reputation among Japanese collectors. He spent decades inside the institutional luxury watch business, watching it from the inside, understanding how brands work, what collectors want, what makes a watch matter. And the entire time he was doing this for 29 years, he was holding a personal taste that nothing in the modern Swiss luxury was producing. Hida loved mid-century classical dress watches, like the Patek Philippe Calatrava, the reference 96, the Breguet reference 3210, small cases, restrained proportions, hand-engraved Breguet numerals, heat-blued steel hands, movements that were beautiful but quiet, and watches that didn't announce themselves. The complete opposite of what you would consider flex culture is what he was drawn to. And the modern luxury market had been moving in the complete opposite direction for decades. Larger cases, more complications, loud design language, more visual branding, much more visible branding as well. And he watched this happen and he helped sell it. But privately, he wished someone would still make the watches that he actually wanted to wear. And so in 2019, at age 58, Hida launched his own brand, right? Naoya Hida and Co. in Tokyo. And he is not a watchmaker by training. Okay. He's a brand builder. He's a curator. So he hired a watchmaker. He hired Kosuke Fujita, and engraver, and Keisuke Kano. And the three of them worked together in a small Tokyo workshop to produce Hida's vision. The collection is structured around numbered types. So, like Type 1, which is the original, was released in 2019. It's a 37 millimeter time only dress watch, and it recently refined itself to a 36 millimeter, so got a little bit smaller. And it has hand engraved Breguet numerals filled with this lacquer, and it's on a German silver dial blank. And it has these leaf shaped hands that are heat blued, has 904L stainless steel cases. The movement is a heavily modified ETA 7750, and it also has a, and now if you know this, if you know the ETA, which I believe it was a chronograph function originally, and so they strip out all the chronograph functions and they add this additional wheel for a center seconds. And so the entire movement is refinished and it's rebuilt to like what I would consider hot horology standards. And the last part that's worth dwelling on, I think, and kind of diving in a bit, is that Hida's team takes kind of vintage Swiss chronograph movements. They remove everything except for the kind of the going train, and then they rebuild it from the foundation into what I would consider a contemporary hand-wound caliber. And the result is a movement that costs them significant amounts of labor to produce, but also allows them to maintain this vertical integration with most of the watch industry that what most of the watch industry is kind of abandoned. And so the clicks of the hand winding mechanism, if you've never heard one before, they've been described by one writer as having like the most satisfying texture of a mechanical, crunchy potato chip, which is for those of you that like to wind your watches, mechanical watches, and hearing this snap, 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 snap. It's just a cool feature that something, again, as we go through and we learn about watches, there's certain things that are tactile and not just the visual components, but when we interact and engage with our watches, we like to have some sort of feedback to us. And so again, the satisfying mechanical crunch of being able to wind your watch is pretty cool. Now the Type 2 is going to do something just a little different. It's going to add a small seconds at 9 o'clock, and it's going to have the same proportions, the same hand engraving with the subtle dial kind of layout in the depth. There's a Type 3 that has the central seconds layout, again, similar classical feel. They also have a Type 6A that was released in 2025. It's a perpetual calendar with Roman numerals on the dial, all hand engraved, and the subdial indicates the year, month, day of the week, and a leap year cycle. And the dial material is this like argentium silver. It's like a tarnish resistant silver. It has this alloy, and it's like 5.3 million yen, which is roughly around 35 grand. Okay, again, time of this recording. Don't hold me to this stuff when you listen to this in 10 years and be like, oh, Riste, you're way off. Now, Type 7A, released in 2026, was the brand's first chronograph, powered by this, again, restored vintage Valjoux caliber. I think it was the 23. And the Valjoux was this legendary Swiss column wheel chronograph. It was produced from like 1916 onward. It was used by like Breitling, Heuer, Gerard Perregaux, Ulysses Nardin, even Patek Philippe in kind of a modified form. And so Hida's team, they restore these vintage examples and then they bring them back up to what I would consider, again, hot horology standards. And then they finally have this Type 8A. And this is also released in 2026. It's a newer one of their newest models, and this is the smallest watch in their collection. It's, just 31 millimeters. It's 8.9 millimeters thick, and it's Hida's homage to the vintage Patek 96 and also the Breguet 3210 dress watches that were inspired by this entire aesthetic. And it's kind of like him saying, it's not necessarily a thank you, but it's kind of like a tip of the hat or a nod to, like, this is my homage, my love letter back to these two watches. And production is, again, it's around 15 to 20 Type 1s per year. Total annual output across the entire collection, I think, is in the dozens. So Hida produces and he kind of posts production counts on his website annually, and it's kind of like a public accountability that I think is pretty unusual in watchmaking, to actually say, like, hey, here's how many watches we made this year, right? Your watch, if you had one, it's one of those numbers. Production price ranges, they go from anywhere between 20,000 and 40,000 for like the time only pieces, and then the complication ones obviously are going to go much higher. In auction terms, Hida's watches have been selling at Phillips since I think about 2022, and original owners include like Mark Cho of the Armory, and recent auctions have resulted in ranges from anywhere between 30 to 35,000 for the time only pieces. So they're holding value, and then some of them. And what makes Hida's work, I think, matter in a non-technical innovation, the watches use modified ETA bases, and so they're not in-house calibers. And I think what makes this matter is taste. 29 years of watchmaking, working in this insider of global luxury and the watch industry and watching how this moves and the watches move in direction. I think Hida did not personally love the direction of what was going on with, Swiss watchmaking. And so then he patiently kind of waited until he could launch a brand that produces with rigor and restraint the watches that he wished had already existed. And I think this is a very different model of independent watchmaking than Asaoka's, for example. And so they're different, but they're real. And so I want to get into another watchmaker now, and this is going to be segment 3. This is the watchmaker who was a soldier and then became a watchmaker. The third watchmaker, Masahiro Kikuno, is fascinating. So Kikuno's origin story, if anything, is even more unusual than what we've just talked about. Asaoka was already a designer. Kikuno started somewhere completely different. I think he was born in February 1983, Kagawa, Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. And as a boy, he was, by all accounts, fascinated with mechanical things. The owner's manual of like the family car, anything with moving parts. So after high school, Kikuno did something most people in the Japanese watchmaking industry have not done. He joined the Japanese Self-Defense Force, the country's military equivalent of, which would be to, there were a variety of different jobs, but his was to repair rifles. And his superiors noticed his skill in dismantling and reassembling precision mechanical objects. Rifle work, as it turns out, is an excellent preparation for watchmaking. Both require extreme precision in disassembling and cleaning and lubricating and then reassembly, and both require a steady hand and this sort of methodical mind. Things have to be done in a very specific order. And those of you that are, you've worked with firearms, or you shoot, or whether it's just, for fun, or you do like any precision rifle work like I do, long range or distance shooting, you kind of understand that of course, there's steady hands and methodical training, but there's also a whole lot of competence and calmness. And so during his military service, a superior officer showed him a high-end mechanical watch. And guess what? Dude was hooked. He was captivated. He saw in the watch the same kind of intricate mechanical beauty he had been working with on the rifles, but now someone had applied that same precision and beauty to timekeeping, and the purposes were to keep time versus ballistics. And so after his discharge, he enrolled in a 3-year watchmaking course in Tokyo. And this was he went to Japan's leading watchmaking school. And again, the program itself that he was with, which was in the kind of the jewelry college in Tokyo, was a WASTEP course. And again, remember, Watchmakers of Switzerland training and education program at the international standard for watchmaking and repair. So the course that he took focused on watch repair, not creation. And so the students learned to like service mechanical watches. They were not learning how to design or build them from raw materials. And that distinction matters because he was trained to maintain existing watches, not to create new ones. But during his final year at the school, he found a book. Guess what book he found? He found a copy of George Daniel's Watchmaking. Again, the same book that Asaoka had used, and decided to teach himself the parts of the craft that his school was not teaching him. So, for his school's graduation project, he, what would be kind of an ordinary repair certificate piece for most students was a perpetual calendar tourbillon, handmade from the ground up by a student. Let me read that again. A perpetual calendar tourbillon that was handmade from the ground up by a student. A student graduating from a school that was designed to give him a certificate on repairing watches. A perpetual calendar is one of the most complicated mechanisms in horology. A tourbillon is another one, so combining them in a single watch is considered like an apex level hot horology achievement. And most professional watchmakers, they spend like decades in the industry before they even attempt such a thing. And our guy here, he made one in his final year as a student. And in 2011, at age 28, Kuno launched his eponymous brand, and eponymous just meaning that it's, named after himself, and presented his work at Basel World. So 3 pieces, kind of this Western style temporal hour watch, a Japanese style emperor temporal watch, and then he also had one that he called the Wadoke, and it was the perpetual calendar tourbillon. So let me explain the Wadoke because it's the most unique, and it's easily one of the most unique Japanese concept watches I think ever produced. So pre-modern Japan through the Edo period until the country adopted the Western 24-hour clocks in 1872, Japan used something called a temporal hour system. So the hours of the day were not equal lengths. The hours between sunrise and sunset were divided into 6 equal parts, and the hours between sunset and sunrise were divided into 6 equal parts. And so, because the length of the day changes with the seasons, the actual duration of each Japanese hour changed throughout the season. So, in summer, for example, like the daylight hours, they were longer than the nighttime hours, and in the winter, they were reversed. And so, the traditional Japanese clocks, they kept time this way, and they called that wadoke, and it's spelled Wadokei. And they were extraordinarily sophisticated mechanisms that these mechanical instruments they had to automatically adjust the length of the hours as the seasons changed. And so Kikuno built wristwatches that do this, not huge clock towers, wristwatches. He calls it the Caliber MK15 movement. It's handmade, and it's a mechanism that automatically adjusts the temporal hour markers based on the season at the wearer's latitude. And this is, by any reasonable measure, the most unique Japanese horological complication in modern watchmaking. It's nuts. In 2013, at age 30, he became the first Japanese full member of AHCI and the youngest member in the Academy's history at that time. And now the subsequent work that he's had explores further Japanese horological traditions and crafts. He has the Orizuru, which I think was in 2013. He has the Mokumi, which I think was in the 2014, and he has this beautiful kind of ability to make metal kind of look like wood grain, and there's this metal smithing technique that again they can produce wood grain patterns but in steel, and he is hand rolling his own dials, which is it's just crazy. So the workshop is in his home, and he's just about like an hour outside of Tokyo, and then like the upstairs bedroom in his home is like his workshop. And then the garage is his machine shop. And then he has a spare restroom that he's converted into his metal treatment facility. I can visualize me telling my wife that I'm going to turn the spare bath into into a workshop, right? Probably wouldn't go over so well in my house with 3 kids. And so there's this entire vertical integration of his watchmaking operation and tapping it literally inside of one house in Japan. And so between like 2012 and 2024, he's produced maybe 20 watches. So 12 years of production, 20 watches. And the price ranges of the watches are anywhere between like the low 30,000 up to $115,000. And they're going to go, I'm assuming that they're going to skyrocket after, the world kind of figures out what he's doing. Now his current production rate is pretty nuts. It's 1 watch per year, and his order book is closed. And he stated that he will reopen for orders, but with extremely limited kind of allocations moving forward. Because again, very similar to all of these other folks, you understand, even with Reshep, for example, they're taking time on each watch. Their goal isn't to produce more watches. Their goal is to impress, right, and to make beautiful pieces of art. And so you can't rush that. And so in addition to kind of his own work, he teaches at his alma mater. He goes back one day per week and he teaches other watchmakers. And he passes this craft on. His goal is to pass on this craft to the next generation of Japanese watchmakers. Very similar to what Philippe Dufour when he mentions, and mentored Roger Smith in the same way that George Daniels accepted Roger Smith as his apprentice, right? And this is in line that's running from what Daniels and Smith and Asaoka and Kikuno, what they're doing is this kind of, in real sense, it's this line of complete hand fabrication and watchmaking, but in a very modern era. And the fact that this new line is passing through this Japanese soldier turned watchmaker who works in his own home outside of Tokyo, I think is such an extraordinary story in modern watchmaking. And again, it's not one that you're going to hear because he's not outside with a megaphone or hiring a team for a social media campaign. He's just making watches. And there's this line in a recent profile of Kikuno that I want to quote directly, where the writer said, "What Roger W. Smith is to Britain, Kikuno is to Japan." And that I think is accurate. It's one of the highest compliments you can get as a contemporary watchmaker, and I think that's the highest compliment you can get and receive. All right, let's get into segment 4. Let's get into Kurono Tokyo, and I would say that this is the accessible Asaoka. So fourth, and it's really just an extension of the Asaoka story, but I'm going to call it segment 4. Okay, so Kurono Tokyo. In 2019, Asaoka co-founded what again is, we tease this, the more accessible brand called Kurono Tokyo. And the brand was designed to bring Asaoka's aesthetic sensibilities, kind of this refined Japanese watch design, considered proportions, subtle dial work to collectors who could not or chose not to spend $25,000 on like a tsunami. Now that's interesting as well because the way that I've framed this is kind of a reminder to folks. Just because you have a certain amount of money to spend doesn't mean that you're going to choose to spend it. And what I mean by that is that just because someone may own a Beauvais, for example, they may also wear a G-Shock, and they may also wear a Kurono Tokyo. And it's not because they're in this world of, they're choosing to flex. They're choosing to pick pieces that they enjoy wearing. And I think that's fascinating. If you have a variety of watches in your collection, and for example, you have your Rolex and you have your Submariner, but then today you want to wear your Laurier, I'm encouraging folks to wear the Laurier. And again, so when I talk about Kurono Tokyo, it's not that it's a lesser brand. The brand is remarkable and they're beautifully made watches, but they don't need to cost $25,000, right? You can find them sub $3,000 and you can find them pre-owned for possibly a little bit less. And so Kurono Tokyo watches are designed by Asoka and his team. Now, they're not handmade by Asoka individually. They use, third-party movements predominantly and prominently. They're using like a Miyota 9000 series. And they're produced in a series with each release kind of issued as a limited edition that typically will sell out within a couple of hours or a couple of minutes, depending on the watch, when they go on sale. Now, again, sub $3,000 Asaoka designed watches. And Kurono Tokyo's lineup includes the Anniversary Mori, the Classic, the Toki. There's a Chronograph 1 and 2, and they have a couple of other various limited editions as well. And the aesthetic, again, is unmistakably Asoka. They're clean dials, they're restrained complications, they're deliberately Japanese design language with this kind of mid-century Eastern European influence. And I think what makes Kurono Tokyo notable beyond the design quality is the cultural movement that it's created. The brand launched just before COVID, the pandemic. And so during the pandemic, Kurono Tokyo became one of the became the most watched, accessible watch brands, I think, in the world. The limited edition releases generated this kind of genuine collector frenzy. The forums exploded, resale prices on the secondary market went kind of crazy, and a Japanese accessible tier watch brand became this globally influential brand because the watches were genuinely good, because Asaoka's name was attached to them. That kind of is the modern Kurono Tokyo story, and it demonstrates, I think, what's possible when a master independent watchmaker decides to extend their aesthetic into accessible price tiers and has that same design eye, but at a different scale. And I think the same Japanese sensibility. And I think Chrono Tokyo has kind of cooled off a little bit now. And so if you've ever considered one and you're like they got a little bit crazy and the prices were a little bit nuts, I think everything's kind of calmed down a little bit now, which is maybe that's your opportunity to take a look at them. Now, segment 5, we're going to get into what I would consider the truly accessible Kyoto brand, which is going to be it's a brand. It's spelled Kuoe. It's Kuoe. Kuoe. Now, we probably pronounce it in the States as Kuo, but it's Kuoe. Kuoe. And they're a micro brand founded by Kenji Uchimura. And Uchimura's origin story, again, is it's non-traditional. I have yet to find a traditional story, an origin story. This guy was studying languages at a university in London, not watchmaking. And while he was there, he walked into what was many of these antique shops in central London, and he saw a vintage Smiths field watch, and the same kind of mid-century British watch that we'll be talking about next week when I get into some more British watchmaking. And he fell in love with it, but he could not afford to buy it, and we all know what that feels like. So he returned to Japan, he took a job at a local watch company in Kyoto, and he learned the trade. And in 2020, he launched Kyoto, and he had one specific mission. His goal was to produce affordable, vintage-inspired Japanese watches at a price point that an ordinary collector could actually afford. So the flagship is their Old Smith. It's a 90-001, and its successors, the 90-002 and the 90-006, the Royal Smith, and the rest of the kind of growing lineup. And the name Old Smith is direct. It's transparent reference to the British Smiths brand that started Uchimura's watch journey. And I think that's such a cool tip of the hat to not only Smiths the brand, but also to the guys over at Time Factors as well. Which, by the way, I've never proposed anything before, but how cool would it be to have a Smiths and then Kuo collaboration watch? I'm just saying. I'm just saying. If you're listening out there, Eddie and Dave, just just know that Riste is interested in one. All right, let's go back to this. So now, again, we talked about how this was a direct connection to transparent references, and the watches look, again, unmistakably like vintage mid-century field watches. They have applied Arabic numerals, they have rail tracks, they have off-white dials, beige lume. Sometimes they can look pre-aged, and some of them have blued hands and steel, and you can make some adjustments as well. They also have 35 and 38 millimeter watch cases, which is fascinating because they're going in the opposite direction of what standard Swiss luxury is moving, right? The movements are usually Miyota or Seiko hand-wound calibers. Occasionally, you'll find them in quartz as well. And then watches are hand-assembled in their workshop by a very small team, and the prices range from like $500 and up. They have higher-end ones now that are, in your. If you get into examples of like chronographs, might be in like a $2,000 range again at the time of this recording, but $500 to $700. And these are again hand-assembled Japanese vintage-inspired watches with mechanical movements in them that are produced in a small shop in Kyoto. And Uchimura has stated publicly that his long-term ambition is to develop an in-house hand-wound caliber, but they're not there yet. And the watches currently use, again, Japanese-sourced third-party movements, but the ambition, I think, is the right ambition. And the fact that he's building it kind of toward this from the price point that he's at, I think it says something about what he's actually trying to do. And this is what I love about Kuo, is that, the reason it belongs in this episode rather than being relegated to like a side mention is that it represents a specific kind of Japanese independent watchmaking that is almost like no other in this what we're discussing. He's talking about something that's accessible, but that's vintage inspired, hand assembled in a single workshop, made by a small team that genuinely cares. And the watches sell for like $500. And they feel like watches that should sell, I think, for upwards of 1,000 or more, maybe 2,000. And if you're a listener who's been listening to this episode and you feel like, everything we discuss is like out of your reach, right? I'm getting into like Asaoka's $25,000 tsunami, right? And Hida's $30,000 Type 1 and, Kikuno's six-figure tourbillon. I think Kuo is not just the entry point. I think a lot of people who have sensibility and then also taste, a lot of them wear Kuo watches and they enjoy them because it's not just like this You're not getting into this tiering system. What you're getting is Japanese sensibility, the same attention to vintage influences, hand assembly in workshops, and then you're getting something that I think is genuine, which is honesty. And again, you can own a Kuo today. The brand ships internationally. You'll wear a watch that's hand assembled by a small team that actually cares about what they're making. And again, I think it's one of the best $500 entries into serious watch collecting that you can make in the world right now. Okay, segment six. Let's get into this Japanese indie tradition and what I would consider is the explanation of the quiet thesis. So let me close this episode with kind of what I've been building towards. Japan has, in the past 15 to 20 years, developed a parallel tradition of independent watchmaking that's running alongside the Swiss apex. Dufour, Journe, Budalainen, Rexchep, and this British revival, which was like Roger W. Smith, who we're going to profile in detail coming up. The Japanese tradition has four characteristics that I think distinguish it from Western counterparts. First, non traditional entry points. Asaoka was a product designer. Hida was a luxury watch distributor. Kikuno was a military rifle technician. Uchimura was a language student who walked into an antique shop in London. So none of these people came up through the conventional watchmaking apprenticeship pathway. And it's unusual. So most Swiss independent watchmakers, they're trained at Wastep. They worked in major manufacturers, and then they went independent. The Japanese indies come from outside the institutional system entirely, and I think that's a fascinating. But it's also probably why some folks are very drawn to their designs and other folks are not. It's because of the way that you were trained about what you should like. And so if you are, say for example, you're looking at some of the Swiss watches and you're like, it doesn't speak to me. But then you look at some of these watches and they speak to you, that's probably why. Now, also, if the Japanese watches don't speak to you, these Swiss watches may speak to you. And that's where people go on Reddit and they go crazy about, I think that this watch is ugly or whatever. Or they take a hot take on it. It's like, yeah, but you're discussing your preferences, and your preferences aren't the be all end all. What I think is beautiful or what I think is restrained luxury, someone may say that's too simple, right? Why are you paying so much money for a watch that looks so simple, right? It's the idea of even what Yema was doing. Yema has movement calibers, for example, on the back, and they're not decorated with anglage and parlage, and they're not overly done. And someone would say, well, it's simpler to go and have a textured dial, right? And then someone else, if you actually talk to a watchmaker, for example, especially one that does handwork, you can say, in some instances, they can say, well, in all of that perlage and all of this stuff, sometimes I can hide mistakes by running it over again. If it's a simple texture dial, or if it looks very simple, or if it's a very simple movement architecture, you can see the mistakes more when it's simple. And so by adding complexity, you can hide things. It's kind of like a Where's Waldo situation, right? So just be aware that just because someone has a preference of something doesn't mean it's the be all end all. It just means that's their preference. So let me get back to this. So we talked about first, there were these non-traditional entry points. Now, second, extreme working conditions, right? Kikuno works in his own house. Asaoka works alone in a Tokyo studio. These workshops are small and the teams are tiny. The annual production numbers are minimal. Asaoka makes fewer than 5 watches per year? Kikuno makes 1? Hida makes a few dozen? This is watchmaking at scales that would be commercially unviable in any other country. And the Japanese indies are doing it anyway because they want to, not because it's commercially viable, not because they're going to try to sell their watches to get acquired by Swatch Group. No, they're doing it because they think it's beautiful, they have a mission and a passion to do so, and they're making something extraordinary. But they're making it because they're passionate about it, not because it's commercially viable. And I think that's fascinating. Third, I think distinctly Japanese aesthetic and technical contributions, right? Kikuno, if you're talking about these dials, they're clean, they're restrained mid-century, they're kind of like this inspired classicism if you're a humanities or a history person. Hida's Type 1 is gorgeous. Asaoka throwing the massive and oversized free-sprung balance that's visible on the dial side is rad. But again, these are not Swiss watches made in Japan. These are Japanese watches made with their own visual and conceptual identity. And again, they may speak to you, and so that's why I'm trying to bring them up, is because you may look at them on Chrono 24, or you may just go Google them and go, oh man, what have I been missing? These are stunning watches. Now, fourth, the direct lineage through George Daniels. Both Asaoka and Kikuno, they taught themselves significant portions of their craft using Daniels's book, Watchmaking. And this is the same book that Roger W. Smith used in his Bolton Garage. The line of teaching that runs from Daniels through Smith, through Asaoka and Kikuno, is the line of complete hand fabrication watchmaking in the modern era. Now, unfortunately, Daniels passed away in 2011, and the book he wrote is, I think, in a real sense, a foundation document in the modern indie watchmaking revival. I would love for that book to live on and continue to inspire new watchmakers. And this is going to be a very bold statement from me. But if you are someone who is hands-on with things and you've worked on engines or cars, or you like tinkering, or you were the kid that took his, parents' VCR apart and put it back together, I beg you to go and pick up a copy of George Daniels' book, Watchmaking. Use this podcast as an inspiration to maybe light the fire that you could become a watchmaker. And just consider that maybe there's this opportunity, right? I'm going to say that you only live once, and if you have dreams and aspirations, there's no better time to start than now. Now, when you look at modern Japanese independent watchmaking through this lens, you see something what I see, which is extraordinary. Japan has its own Dufors. Japan has its own Reshepes. Japan has its own Smiths. They have existed for more than a decade or more. But now, Western collectors are only beginning to notice this, right? If you take one practical action from this step, again, and here's my suggestion, follow what these guys are doing. Look at what Asaoka's doing. Look at what Hida's doing. Look at what Kikuno's doing. Try to find them on social media. Read about their watches. Look at the auction results. And I think you'll start to recognize the work. You may never own one, and that's fine. I probably won't either. But the names should be in our vocabulary as independent watch collectors or enthusiasts or hobbyists or just people that enjoy this space. I think their work deserves to be known, and I think in 5, 10, 15 years, when the names are being discussed, they should be discussed in the same breath as Dufour and Journe. And hopefully this podcast is going to help you know them first, okay? All right, segment 7, let's talk about what's going to come up next in our teaser for episode 18. Oh my goodness, episode 18. So next week, we're going to go from Japan and we're going to go to Britain. If you have been paying attention, you have noticed that I've been teasing and talking about George Daniels and the appearance I've been doing this repeatedly for the last couple of episodes. And he was the influence behind the Crador micro artist studio and the hand finishing techniques. And again, he wrote the book that taught Asaoka and Kikuno their crafts. And he is the central figure of the modern revival of complete hand fabrication in watchmaking. So next week, we're going to get into George Daniels' home country, the British watchmaking tradition, and 3 centuries of British contributions to horology. Harrison and the marine chronometer. Oh, you know I love a chronometer. I love those marine chronometers. Give me a small seconds, right? We're going to talk about Mudge and the lever escapement, and then Daniels and the coaxial escapement. I mean, if you hear coaxial and you don't think about, George Daniels, and you're not thinking about Omega, right? And we're going to talk about the British watchmaking, the industry that nearly died across the 20th century, and how this modern revival is being led again by a small group of watchmakers that includes Daniels' apprentice, right? Roger W. Smith on the Isle of Man, whom we've been promising for a couple of episodes, and now I'm finally going to deliver. Plus, we're going to get into some more modern, accessible brands. I'm going to talk about Christopher Ward finally. I'm going to get a little bit deeper into Fears and Garrick and the legitimate British military watch suppliers. And again, I have already talked about CWC as well. So British watchmaking next week. Don't miss it. All right, folks, that is episode 17 of What's on Your Riste. To Asaoka for teaching yourself watchmaking with the George Daniels book and machines from eBay, and for surprising your fellow watchmakers in Switzerland, and for proving that the conventional path to hot horology is not the only path. You're awesome. To Hida for waiting 29 years inside the luxury watch business until you could launch your own brand that produced watches the way that you wanted to wear. We are in awe and inspired. To Kikuno, from going from rifle repair in the Japanese self-defense force to becoming the first Japanese full member of the AHCI for keeping the tradition alive in watchmaking, thank you. And to Kurono Tokyo for proving that Asaoka's design eye can scale, thank you for that gift. And then finally, to the team at Kuo for building this Kyoto workshop that produces $500 watches that feel like they should cost $2,000. And for keeping the dream alive at an accessible level, this hobby is richer because all of you exist. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you were introduced to anyone in this list that you'd never heard of before, I hope this episode did its job. Go look them up, take a look at their watches, and then come back and tell me what you think. I'm Watchovski. Take care of yourselves and wear something good. Maybe it's going to be from Japan.
In a small room in Kyoto, a lens of morning on your hands. You turn the wheel so gently, like you're teaching time to stand. Tiny screws, tiny wonders, under one low wooden beam. You build a heart that ticks alone from your father's old daydream. Kirei, so clean, one by one you shape the world. Sakai, it leans till the second finds its curl. One watch, one soul, made by hand. One watch, one soul, in your palm. No factory line can steal that glow. One watch, one soul, let it go. Plans beside the rice bowl, steel dust on the tatami. You file the edge, you chase the beat, till the gears can sing in harmony. Every face in every window gets a different shade of time. Yours don't shout from glass and gold, they just walk a straighter line. Kirei, so clean, one by one you shape the world. Sakai, it leans till the second finds its curl. One watch, one soul, made by hand. One watch, one soul, in your palm. No factory line can steal that glow. One watch, one soul, let it go. To the hush, from the rain to lacquered wood, you keep the old flame breathing and you make it better good. Out of sleep, out of steel, out of love and little scars, you put a universe together in a room smaller than a star. One watch, one soul, made by hand. One watch, one soul.